Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and this week we're talking about sharing your story. And no, I don't mean you all have to write in and tell me what your story is. Certainly you guys can feel free to do that. If you're listening to this and you want to reach out, you can always reach me at info@chasinghappiness.ca. But what I mean when I say that is every single one of us has lived a very unique life. There are lessons that we've learned that other people could benefit from. And while I'm not advocating that every single person needs to go on social media and share their entire story, what I am saying is for most of us, there are people in our lives, whether they be friends, family, students, acquaintances, business partners, whatever they happen to be, who might be able to learn something from us. The same way I'm always saying we can learn something from everyone we come in contact with, it applies to your story as well. There are things people can learn from you. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sharing more of my story this year. Why over the next 12 months, you're going to hear more about me personally and my life and my struggles and how I got to where I am today. For longtime listeners of this podcast, you know when I started this podcast, I actually didn't think I was going to upload the very first episode. I didn't think I had anything worthwhile to share. Now that may have been a handful of years ago, but I think that's a fear that a lot of people have. And the truth is, it doesn't matter who you are. Your story has value to someone. There is something that someone can learn from everything you've been through. I grew up in a very low income family. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. I am dyslexic, so school wasn't easy for me. I had a chaotic home life, so I chose to lose myself in books growing up as much as I possibly could. I dropped out of high school so that I could get a job and get a place of my own. And yet my story didn't end there. I went back to school. I went to college and then university years after my peers did. In fact, I remember walking into one of my psychology seminars, and I was the oldest person in the room by a number of years. And I remember thinking to myself when I walked into that room for the first time, are you really sure you want to do this? Are you really sure you want to be the oldest person sitting at this table? And thankfully, of course, I stayed. I ended up getting my degree. I learned a lot from that class specifically, as well as all of my others. But my circumstances could have been very different if I had chosen to walk away. I would not be where I am today. I would not be talking to you here on this podcast if I hadn't made the choices that I did along the way, if I hadn't learned lessons along the way to get me to where I am today. And that's why it's important that we share our stories, so that other people who are living through something that you lived through know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that there is something to look forward to, that they can get to the other side. I'll tell you, listening to this podcast right now, I'm working on a book. It's not something I've told anybody about yet. So you, listener, are the very first person to know, but it talks a little bit about my story and my journey, because I think there are lessons in that story that everyone can benefit from. So I'm willing to share some of that vulnerable information so that if you're in a position where you're not sure that things are going to get better, you have an example of how they can. You can look for the light at the end of the tunnel and see you're not alone. That's why it's important that we share our stories, because we've been there. We know that it's hard. We know that we don't get out of it completely alone. There are people along the way who help us, and in turn, we need to help others. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to run out and tell everyone your personal story, but keep an eye out in your life for people who are struggling, maybe through something similar to what you went through. Is there something you can teach them? Is there something you can give them? Is there some wisdom that will help them get through it? Or do they just need someone to be a shoulder that they can cry on? Think back to that time in your life when you were struggling. Would it have helped to have a shoulder to cry on? Would it have helped to have someone give you a hand? We all have valuable lessons that we can teach others, and it doesn't have to be us teaching the whole world. It could be one person in your personal life who benefits from your story, but we all have a story that's worth sharing for someone to help someone. And the truth is, if my story can help just one person not feel alone in the world, then I'm absolutely willing to share it. And I hope you guys feel the same way. Thank you to all of you who have reached out over the last couple of weeks about the podcast. I love hearing from you. Again, you can reach me at info@chasinghappiness.ca. And if you want to help to keep the podcast ad-free, you can join our Patreon page. There is a link in the description for this podcast. The funds collected through Patreon go towards the cost of editing and producing and hosting the podcast. If you're new to the podcast and you don't know much about us here at Chasing Happiness, our website is www.chasinghappiness.ca. I hope you guys all have an amazingly wonderful week, and I will chat with you next week. Bye for now.